What was your call sign, hero? The question hit the air like a slap. A room full of officers in dress whites went still, waiting, laughing some of them, because surely the boat mechanic in the worn jacket had no answer worth hearing. Bree Sutter met the Admiral's eyes. 2 words left her mouth: steel wraith. A glass shattered somewhere behind the crowd. A chief petty officer shot to his feet so fast his chair screamed against concrete. And Admiral Vivian Kessler, sharp, composed, untouchable, froze. Just for a second. Just long enough for everyone watching to see something crack behind her eyes. Because 8 years ago, 3 men died in an ambush that was never supposed to happen. And the woman who buried the truth to save her own career just came face to face with the one person who survived it. The ghost was never dead. She was standing in the room the whole time. Cedar Harbor smelled like salt and diesel and second chances. Bree Sutter knew that smell the way other people knew their own heartbeat. Automatic, unquestioned. She'd built her whole life around it, board by board, year by year, until the smell stopped being a reminder of anything and just became home. Except tonight it wasn't just home. Tonight it was the last quiet night before everything cracked open. She didn't know that yet. Standing in the boatyard at dusk, wrench in her hand, grease under her nails, she only knew the engine in front of her was stubborn, and that Marlowe would be home soon with dinner, and a permission slip, and that particular look she got when she wanted something. Bree twisted the bolt, felt it give, small victories. Because that was the thing about boats, you could fix them. You could take something broken and make it whole again with your hands, with patience, with the right tool at the right angle. People weren't like that. People stayed broken in places you couldn't reach with a wrench. She wiped her hands on a rag that had been white once, looked up at the sky bruising orange over the water, and for 1 second, just one, she let herself breathe. Then the gate creaked. "Don't get comfortable," Marlowe called out. Backpack slung over one shoulder, cello case slung over the other, a paper bag of takeout dangling from 2 fingers like she'd carried it that way the whole walk from town. "I need a signature." "You always need a signature." "This one's important." Bree set down the wrench. "They're all important. That's what you said about the field trip to the aquarium. That was important. There were sharks." Marlowe: "Fine. This one's more important." Bree took the paper. "Read it once. Read it again, slower, because the second time her eyes caught on 4 words and held there like a splinter. Naval Base Fundraiser. Something in her chest did the thing it always did. Tightened, went quiet, waited. She didn't let it show. She'd gotten good at that. 8 years of practice, and her face had become a locked door nobody could pick. "Music programs shutting down if they don't raise the money," Marlowe said, watching her sister's face too closely for someone who claimed not to notice things. "Principal Hale says it's the whole department. Not just orchestra. I heard you the first time so?" Bree looked at the paper, at the line where a parent or guardian was supposed to sign. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the easy ones: work, time, the long drive, and the real one, the one sitting in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed 8 years ago and never quite digested. She signed it anyway, because Marlowe had given up enough, because the cello was the only thing that girl had, that was entirely hers, entirely good, untouched by everything that came before, and because Bree Sutter had spent 8 years building a wall between her old life and this one, brick by brick, and she was not going to let that wall crack over a school fundraiser. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. "There," she said, handing the slip back. "Happy?" Marlowe grinned, and for a second she looked exactly like their mother. Same crooked tooth, same way of tilting her head when she'd won something. Ecstatic. "Don't push it. Wouldn't dream of it." They ate dinner on the porch that night. Paper cartons balanced on their knees, the harbor going purple and then black in front of them. Marlowe talked about the piece she was learning. Something slow and aching that made Bree's ribs hurt to listen to, even hummed off-key between bites of orange chicken. "It's called an adagio," Marlowe said. "It's supposed to feel like grief, like actual, physical grief. Sounds fun. It's beautiful. You wouldn't get it. I get grief fine." The words came out flatter than she meant them to. Marlowe looked up. Something passed over her face, not quite worry, not quite a question, just a flicker of the thing she never asked about. Because she'd learned, somewhere along the way, not to. Bree stood up, gathered the cartons, changed the subject with her body instead of her mouth. Early morning tomorrow, she said. Get some sleep, you too. I sleep fine. She didn't. She never had. Not since Operation Coldwater. Not since the compound outside a border town with a name she still couldn't say out loud without her jaw locking. Not since 3 names got carved into a wall, in a place most people never saw. And a 4th name, hers, got buried somewhere. No one could find it. That night she stood at the kitchen window, long after Marlowe's light went dark down the hall. Watched the harbor. Watched the Navy vessels, blinking red and white against black water in the distance. The way they always did. The way they had every night for 8 years. Patient and indifferent, like they didn't know they were, haunting her. Something in her chest pulled tight, because tomorrow she was walking back through a gate she swore she'd never walk through again. Except this time it wasn't for her, it was for Marlowe, which made it not simple at all. The morning came too fast, the way mornings did when you hadn't slept. All gray light and cold coffee, and Marlowe humming that adagio under her breath while she checked her cello strings for the 4th time. You're going to wear a groove in those strings, Bree said. You're going to wear a groove in the floor. Sit down. I'm fine, you're pacing. I'm not pacing. She was pacing. The bus idled outside the school at 7:40, a long yellow shape swallowing kids and instrument cases, and the particular chaos of teenagers pretending not to be nervous. Bree had volunteered to chaperone. Principal Hale had looked surprised. Marlowe had looked pleased in a way she tried very hard to hide and failed completely. Bree told herself it was because someone needed to keep an eye on the group. Told herself it had nothing to do with wanting to see her sister's face when she played somewhere that actually mattered. She was lying to herself. She was good at that too, when she needed to be. The drive to the base took 40 minutes. Bree sat near the front, watching the landscape shift from small-town storefronts to open highway to the long stretch of chain-link fence that meant they were close. Her hands, she noticed, had gone still on her knees. Steady, too steady. The kind of stillness that used to mean something was about to happen. Naomi Ruiz, the school librarian who helped run the music program, dropped into the seat beside her without asking. You've done this before, Naomi said. Not a question. Done what? Checkpoints. The way you had your ID out before the driver even asked. Bree kept her eyes on the road ahead. Lucky guess. Sure, Naomi didn't push, but she didn't look away either, not for a long moment, like she was filing something into a drawer marked later. At the gate, a young guard leaned into the driver's window, scanned a clipboard, waved them forward with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times that week alone. Bree watched the exchange without meaning to. Catalogued the guard's posture, his sidearm, the angle of the camera mounted above the booth. Old habits. She thought she'd killed them years ago. She hadn't. They'd just been sleeping. The base opened up in front of them, wide and gray and precise. Buildings arranged with a symmetry that felt less like architecture and more like discipline made visible. Marlowe pressed her face to the window like a kid at an aquarium, which, Bree supposed, she basically was. It's huge, Marlowe whispered. It's a base. It's huge. Bree didn't argue. She was too busy noticing the way her own spine had straightened without her permission. The way her eyes had already mapped 3 exits before the bus finished parking. Hangar 4 stood at the far end of the tarmac. Doors thrown open, flags hung in careful intervals along the steel beams inside. Rows of folding chairs, a stage, a backdrop bearing an insignia Bree didn't recognize, some fictional emblem for the base's community outreach division. And underneath it, already gathering, a crowd dressed in their Sunday best mixed with dress whites, mixed with the particular nervous energy of teenager about to perform. Bree helped unload instrument cases. Kept her hands busy, kept her eyes busier. She told herself she was scanning for practical things, where the restrooms were, where the exits were, normal chaperone things. She was lying to herself again. Because the truth was simpler and uglier. The truth was that every flag, every uniform, every clipped word of military courtesy she overheard was a small hook dragging her backward, toward a night she'd spent 8 years trying not to remember and remembering anyway. Every single day, in the quiet moments right before sleep never came. The hangar had been dressed for ceremony. Photographs lined the walls, sanitized, careful, the kind of images meant to inspire without revealing anything real. Display boards told a story of service and sacrifice in bullet points and soft lighting. None of it looked like the truth. None of ceremony ever did. Near the front, students tuned instruments in a focused, chaotic hum. Marlowe settled into a folding chair, cello between her knees, bow moving in short practice strokes. "You okay?" she asked, glancing up at Bree. "Fine. You don't look fine." "I look exactly like someone who's fine." Marlowe's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "That's not a real sentence. It's real enough." A hush moved through the room before Bree saw the cause of it. A woman entered through a side door, flanked by 2 aides, moving through the crowd with the kind of gravity that bent the air around her. Trim, precise, a face built for cameras and command both. Shundodok Vivian Kessler. Bree didn't need an introduction, didn't need a name tag or a rank insignia to know who she was looking at. Something in her body recognized the shape of that woman before her mind caught up. Some old alarm system flaring to life in her spine, in the base of her skull, in the place where memory lived even when you didn't want it to, because she knew that voice. She'd heard it once, 8 years ago, crackling through a comm line in the dark, calm and confident and utterly, catastrophically wrong. Bree's hands went cold. She told herself it couldn't be her, told herself the voice on the comm that night had belonged to someone whose face she'd never actually seen. Someone whose name she'd only ever heard secondhand, filtered through radio static and blood loss, and the particular fog that settled over your brain when you were carrying a child through hostile territory, with 3 of your own people dead behind you. She told herself a lot of things in that hangar. Most of them were wrong. Kessler worked the room with practiced ease, stopping at each cluster of families, offering handshakes, offering warmth, calibrated exactly to the temperature the moment required. Her remarks landed sharp enough to draw laughter, personal enough to feel earned. Bree watched her do it and felt something curdle low in her stomach, because she'd seen that kind of performance before. Not this exact version, but the shape of it. The practiced ease of someone who'd learned, a long time ago, that charm was a weapon just like any other. The orchestra began to play before Bree could untangle the feeling. Marlowe's solo rose out of the group during the adagio, the piece she'd been practicing for weeks. And for a moment, just a moment, Bree forgot everything else in the room. Forgot Kessler. Forgot the flags. Forgot the 8 years of silence she'd built her whole life on top of. Because her sister was extraordinary. Because the sound coming out of that cello was aching and clean and impossibly mature for someone who still left her socks on the bathroom floor. Because for 4 minutes, Bree Sutter was just a proud older sister sitting in a folding chair. Nothing else, nothing more complicated than that. Then the piece ended, and the meet and greet began. And the 4 minutes were over. Kessler moved through the crowd of students and parents with that same practiced warmth, and Bree tried to angle herself toward the back, toward the wall, toward anywhere that wasn't directly in her path. It didn't work, because Kessler noticed her, not the way she noticed the other parents, polite, distant, professionally warm. She noticed her the way a predator notices stillness in tall grass, a pause, a recalibration behind the eyes. "You served," Kessler said. Not a question, a statement dressed up as friendly. Bree kept her face neutral, locked door, no give, long time ago. Kessler's smile sharpened at the edges. Something playful and cutting at once. Let me guess. Motor pool. Supply. A few nearby parents laughed, soft and easy, the way people laughed at things they didn't understand the weight of. Bree said nothing. Her jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that Naomi, standing a few feet away, caught it and went very still. Kessler leaned in, playing to the small crowd that had gathered without meaning to. Her voice dropped into something performative, entertaining. the tone of someone who'd never once had to worry about being wrong in public. "Come on," she said, "don't be shy. What was your call sign, hero?" The question hit the air and just hung there. Bree felt it land somewhere below her ribs, felt 8 years of careful silence, strain against something that wanted badly, violently, to break, because she could lie. She'd lied before. She could say something small and forgettable, something that would let this moment slide past like water and go back to being a boat mechanic with a sister and a quiet life and no ghosts standing in dress blues in front of her. Except Marlowe was watching. Except the room had gone strangely, expectantly quiet. The way rooms did right before something happened that people would talk about later. Except something in Bree, something old, something that had been buried under 8 years of engine grease, and school pickups and grocery runs refused, just this once, to stay buried. She met Kessler's eyes. "Steel Wraith," she said. 2 words, quiet, level, and utterly, completely wrong for the room to absorb calmly. Someone dropped a glass near the refreshment table. The sound of it shattering against concrete seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed. An older man near the back, a chief petty officer, 30 years of service written into the lines of his face, stood up so fast, his folding chair scraped backward across the floor. Kessler's smile stayed fixed, but something behind her eyes shifted, recalculated. The way a predator recalculates when the tall grass turns out to have teeth. Bree watched her do it. Watched the exact moment Kessler's confidence cracked just barely. Just enough for someone trained to notice, noticing to catch it. Because Bree Sutter had spent years reading rooms like this one. Reading faces. Reading the half-second gap between a lie forming and a lie being told. And what she read on Vivian Kessler's face, in that half-second, wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Which meant the voice on the comm line 8 years ago hadn't belonged to a stranger after all. Marlowe's hand found the edge of her cello case and gripped it, knuckles white. She stared at her sister like she was seeing her. For the first time, the quiet woman who fixed boats and packed her lunches and taught her to double knot her shoes had just become someone else entirely. Or maybe, Marlowe thought, she'd always been that someone else, hiding in plain sight, and Marlowe had simply never had the eyes to see it. A woman approached from the side of the room, trim, sharp-eyed, moving with the deliberate calm of someone whose job was to notice things other people missed. Her insignia marked her as senior staff. She addressed Bree with a careful, formal respect that hadn't been in the room a moment before. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "Commander Alvarez, do you still carry any mission currency? Challenge coin, insignia, anything?" Bree hesitated, just a breath, then she reached into her jacket pocket, force of habit. The coin had lived there for 8 years, worn smooth from being turned over and over in the dark, and produced a small, tarnished coin. She placed it in Alvarez's open palm without ceremony. Alvarez turned it over, read the markings, and her face went very, very still, because that coin matched a description buried in a classified briefing she'd read once, years ago, tied to an operation that officially did not exist. Kessler recovered her composure with practiced speed, her voice sliding back into diplomatic polish. "Thank you for your service," she said. The words were correct. They landed cold anyway. Several junior officers nearby shifted, almost without meaning to, into subtle postures of respect, a small, involuntary adjustment that Kessler clearly noticed, and just as clearly didn't like. The power in the room had rearranged itself in a way she hadn't authorized and couldn't immediately reclaim. Bree felt the eyes on her. Felt Marlowe's stare, wide and stunned. Felt Naomi's careful attention and Alvarez's professional focus and the low murmur already starting at the edges of the crowd. She wanted to disappear. She wanted, more than she'd wanted anything in 8 years, to be back in the boatyard with grease under her nails and nothing more complicated than a stubborn bolt in front of her. Instead, she stood there, because there was nowhere left to go. Across the hangar, phones were already coming out. Not for photos that was forbidden inside the facility, but for texts, quick and urgent, thumbs moving fast. Within minutes, 2 words were traveling through channels that had nothing to do with a school fundraiser. Steel wraith. Pulling up fragments. After-action reports. Redacted files nobody had ever been able to fully explain. Naomi appeared at Marlowe's side, one hand settling gently on her shoulder. "Breathe," she murmured. The same thing she said before every performance. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Marlowe nodded, though her hands were still shaking. Bree stood very still while the room reorganized itself around her, the way a tide reorganizes sand without asking permission. Kessler brought the event to a swift, polished close, thanking everyone for their participation, their support. Her voice smooth and even, but her eyes kept cutting back to Bree, with something that had stopped being curiosity and started being calculation. As the crowd began to disperse, Alvarez made a point of shaking Bree's hand, held it a beat longer than necessary. "We should talk," she said quietly. "Not here, not now, soon." Bree nodded once. End of week. Marlowe crossed to her side without a word, and they walked out together, sister and sister, through a gauntlet of eyes that saw them both differently now than they had an hour ago. The bus ride home was quiet in a way that felt loud. Marlowe sat with her cello case pressed against her side like a shield, staring out the window at the gray highway sliding past. She didn't ask right away. Bree noticed that, filed it away as one more thing her sister had learned not to push. But halfway home, somewhere between the base and Cedar Harbor, Marlowe finally spoke, her voice small in a way it hadn't been in years. "Who are you?" she said. Not really a question, more like she was testing whether the words could even survive being said out loud. Bree kept her eyes on the window. "Same person I was this morning." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." Marlowe was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied. Some of the shock burned off into something harder, something closer to determination. "Okay," she said. "Then tonight you're going to tell me the real one." Bree didn't answer, but something in her chest, the thing she'd kept locked for 8 years, bricked up behind grease-stained hands and quiet mornings and a life built entirely to avoid this exact moment, cracked, not shattered, not yet. Just cracked, a hairline fracture running through 8 years of silence. By the time they reached the house, the sun had dropped low over the harbor, painting the water the color of old pennies. Bree stood in the driveway for a long moment before going inside, watching the light change, feeling the weight of a decision she hadn't fully made, yet settle onto her shoulders like something physical, because she could still lie tonight. Could still say it was nothing. A case of mistaken identity, a coincidence dressed up in dramatic lighting. Marlowe was smart, but she was also 18-19, old enough to know when she was being managed, and young enough to still, somewhere underneath the sharpness, want to believe her sister when she said everything was fine. Bree had used that want before, more than once, to protect her, to keep the wall standing. She wasn't going to use it tonight. Inside, Marlowe set her cello case down with unusual care, like the ordinary motion of an ordinary evening might somehow undo everything that had just happened. She dropped onto the couch, waited. Bree didn't sit. She walked instead to the hall closet, pulled a chair over, climbed up, and reached to the highest shelf, where a small metal box had sat untouched for exactly as long as she'd lived in this house. 8 years of dust. 8 years of never once being opened. She set it on the coffee table between them. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The box just sat there, ordinary and unremarkable, gray metal with a simple latch, giving no indication at all of the weight it carried. "What is that?" Marlowe asked. Quiet now. All the earlier heat gone out of her voice, replaced by something more careful. "Everything I never told you." "That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be." Bree opened the latch. Inside, a folded American flag, corners crisp despite the years. A photograph, faces deliberately blurred beyond recognition. A tarnished coin identical to the one she'd handed Alvarez that afternoon. And a set of dog tags she'd never once been able to throw away. No matter how many times she'd tried. Marlowe reached out, touched the edge of the flag with 2 fingers, like it might dissolve if she pressed too hard. "Whose is this?" she whispered. Bree closed her eyes, opened them again, and began. 8 years ago, she said, "I was part of a team. Direct action. We were sent into a compound to extract a high-value target. Intelligence said light security. Quick in, quick out. Okay. It was wrong, all of it. The target wasn't there. Bree's voice stayed level, stripped down to something clinical, the way she'd trained herself to talk about the worst night of her life without letting it own her while she said it. Instead, we found hostages, 3 of them, bound in a basement room. Marlowe's breath caught. She said nothing. Rules of engagement were clear, Bree continued. Abort, extract, let command reassess. A pause. I didn't. You took them. I took them. The room went very quiet. Outside, the harbor made it small. Endless sounds, water against the dock, a gull somewhere, the creak of an old boat settling for the night. Inside, the only sound was Bree's voice, and the particular silence of someone listening to something they weren't ready to hear, but couldn't stop hearing anyway. The extraction point was supposed to be clear, Bree said. It wasn't. Someone was waiting for us. Not random, not bad luck, positioned, disciplined. The kind of ambush that only happens when somebody knows exactly where you're going to be and exactly when you're going to be there. She stopped, swallowed, kept going, because stopping now would mean never finishing, and she'd promised herself, somewhere in that hangar, somewhere between the shattering glass and Marlowe's stunned face, that tonight, finally, she would finish. 3 of my people went down in the first minute. Briggs took rounds to the chest. Doyle died covering the hostages. Marsh bled out before we reached the rally point. Her voice didn't break. It wanted to. She didn't let it. I carried 2 of the kids myself. Miles of hostile ground. Nothing but a sidearm and whatever was left of me by the end of it. Marlowe's eyes had filled, though she hadn't let the tears fall yet. The official story, she said carefully. It's not this, is it? No. Bree's jaw tightened. The official story blamed the team. Said we disobeyed orders. Said the ambush was the predictable result of bad judgment. It buried the fact that someone in the command chain either failed catastrophically, she paused, or leaked our position on purpose. And the woman today, Kessler. She was the mission coordinator that night. Bree's voice went flat. Careful. The way people talked about things they'd rehearsed alone in the dark 1,000 times and never once said out loud. Young, ambitious, newly promoted into a role that gave her access to everything and the authority to make real-time calls. You think she? I don't think anything yet. Bree's hands curled into fists on her knees. I know she shaped the story afterward. I know 3 men died, and I know somebody decided it was easier to let them carry the blame than admit what actually went wrong that night. Marlowe was crying now, quietly, the way she'd cried as a kid when she thought no one was watching. She reached over, set down nothing, because her hands were already empty, and wrapped her arms around her sister instead. The embrace was fierce, wordless, the kind that said everything language couldn't reach. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice had steadied into something Bree recognized, the same stubborn steel that had gotten Marlowe through every hard thing in her short life so far. What happens now? She asked. Bree looked at the flag, the coin, the photograph with its blurred, unknowable faces. I don't know, she said, but whatever happens, you come first, always. Marlowe nodded slowly. She understood, or she was starting to. Her sister had spent 8 years building a quiet life, because silence had been the only way to keep moving forward. The only way to bury something too heavy to carry in the open. But silence had a cost. Bree had known that for years and pretended not to. And now, sitting in a small living room, with a metal box open on the coffee table and her sister's face wet with tears in front of her, she understood something else too. Maybe it was time to pay a different price. Outside, the harbor kept its rhythm, indifferent and patient, the way it always had. A bell buoy rang somewhere in the dark, faint and steady, marking time the way it had marked 8 years of Bree's careful, deliberate, aching silence. She didn't sleep that night either. She sat at the kitchen table, long after Marlowe finally drifted off, the metal box still open in front of her, and stared at 3 names she'd carried alone for 8 years. Briggs, Doyle, Marsh. Because somewhere out there their families still believed the lie, still believed their sons, their brothers, had died because of bad leadership and reckless decisions instead of the truth, that they'd died doing the right thing, and someone had buried that truth to protect a career. And somewhere out there, Vivian Kessler was probably doing the exact same thing tonight, sitting somewhere quiet, recalculating, deciding how to survive the fact that a ghost she thought she'd buried 8 years ago had just stood up in a hangar full of witnesses and said her name back to her. Bree closed the box, latched it, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't put it back on the shelf. She left it on the table instead, because tomorrow she suspected she was going to need it. She was right about that too. She just didn't know yet how right, or how fast, or how much further the ground beneath her careful, quiet life was about to fall away. 3 days later they came, 2 of them, both in their late 30s, both moving with the kind of careful economy of people whose bodies had been asked to do more than bodies were built to do. One walked with a slight hitch, favoring his left side in a way that spoke of old injuries never fully healed. The other carried himself with the coiled stillness of someone who'd trained his nervous system to stay ready even when nothing was happening. They stood at the edge of the boatyard, just outside the fence, waiting the way people wait when they've learned patience the hard way. Bree saw them from the office window and knew immediately who she was looking at. She set down the wrench in her hand, the same one from that first quiet evening. It seemed, though it had been 3 days now, 3 days that felt like 3 years, wiped her palms on a rag and walked out slowly. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The harbor made its small sounds behind them. A gull called somewhere overhead. Then the taller one grinned, a grin that carried 8 years of grief and relief, and something like brotherhood all folded into one expression. "Wraith," he said, "you stubborn, impossible." His voice caught. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. "Decker," Bree said, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 sleepless nights finally loosened. They shook hands in silence. Men and women like them didn't need words for this part, never had. The other one, quieter, more careful with his movements, stepped forward. "Next." "Malone," he said simply, though Bree already knew. Had known the second she saw him standing at the fence. Some things you didn't forget, no matter how hard you tried. Malone's hand, when it met hers, trembled slightly. Not from weakness, from something closer to disbelief. "We heard," he said. "Word travels fast when it needs to. I figured it would." 8 years, Decker said, shaking his head slowly, like the number itself was hard to hold. 8 years, we thought. He stopped, started again. "We didn't know if you were even alive. After Coldwater, after everything went sideways, you just disappeared. I had to, we know that now." Malone's voice was quieter, steadier. "We didn't know it then." Bree led them inside, past the boats waiting for repair, into the small office attached to the main shed where the coffee was bad and the chairs didn't match, and none of it mattered at all. They sat. For a while, nobody talked about the mission. Not directly. They talked instead about the years since the ordinary, grinding weight of trying to build a life on top of a memory that refused to stay buried. Decker told her about his medical discharge, about the years lost to painkillers, before he found his way clear of them, about a marriage that hadn't survived what came after Coldwater, and a daughter he saw every other weekend now, which was better than nothing, he said, though his voice suggested it still didn't feel like enough. Malone talked about contracting work, about nightmares that still came some nights, unpredictable and unwelcome, dragging him back to a basement room and the sound of children crying in the dark, about a grandchild who'd just learned to walk, which was the first thing in years, he said, that had made the nightmares feel worth surviving. And eventually, carefully, they talked about the ones who hadn't made it home to have any of that. Briggs, Doyle, Marsh, men who didn't get to grow old, whose families had spent 8 years believing a lie built specifically to protect the person responsible for their deaths. "They deserve better," Decker said quietly, staring into his coffee like it might have an answer in it. "Their families, I mean. They deserve to know the truth." Malone nodded slowly. "We all do." Bree looked between them, 2 men who'd walked through fire beside her once, and were still somehow willing to walk through whatever came next, and felt the last of her hesitation give way to something harder, something closer to resolve. Because silence had protected her for 8 years, had let her build a life, however careful, however quiet, around the wreckage of that night. But it hadn't protected Briggs, or Doyle, or Marsh. It had only protected the person who'd let them die and then rewritten the story to survive it. That afternoon, Commander Alvarez arrived at the boatyard with an update that landed heavier than Bree expected. The preliminary review, she explained, had already uncovered communications that placed Vivian Kessler at the center of the intelligence failure that night. She'd known, before the missions even launched, that the compound carried heavier surveillance than the initial briefing suggested. She'd known the extraction route had been compromised, and she'd made the calculated decision to proceed anyway, betting that a successful capture would outweigh whatever risk that knowledge represented. When the mission collapsed and 3 men died, she'd shaped the narrative that followed to protect herself, and her career had continued its upward trajectory in the years since, built quietly on top of 3 unmarked graves and a lie nobody had thought to question. It was a gamble, Alvarez said, a cold, ambitious gamble, and for 8 years it had worked. Bree listened without speaking, her hands flat on the table, her jaw set in a line that hadn't relaxed since the hangar. Marlowe came home from school later that afternoon and found her sister sitting at the kitchen table with 2 strangers and a naval officer, the metal box still open between them like it had simply never been closed. She set down her cello case slowly, taking in the scars, the weariness, the strange unspoken current running between the 3 people who'd clearly been through something together that no ordinary conversation could touch. She sat, listened, asked when they finished the only question that mattered to her. "Is this going to hurt him?" she asked, gesturing without meaning to at her sister, though she caught herself and corrected. "Her. Is this going to hurt her?" Decker looked at Bree, then back at Marlowe. "No, kid," he said gently. "This is going to help her." Bree wasn't so sure. She'd built 8 years of peace on top of silence, board by careful board, and now she was being asked to tear it all back down in front of witnesses, in public, with no guarantee the truth would land the way it deserved to. But Marlowe surprised her, leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, chin steady in a way that made her look, for just a moment, far older than 19. "You should go to Washington," she said. "When they ask you to testify, you should go." Bree studied her sister's face, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was fear talking instead of certainty. She didn't find any. "You'll be okay here," Bree said. "Not quite a question, I'll be fine." Naomi said she'd check in, and besides, a small real smile broke through the seriousness of the moment. "I've got a concert next week. Somebody has to hold down the fort." Bree felt something in her chest come loose, just slightly, the way a knot finally gives after being pulled too tight for too long. She looked at Decker and Malone, these 2 men who'd walked through fire beside her once and were apparently prepared to do it again, and nodded. They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Alvarez agreed to coordinate the logistics with the review board's office. Naomi, once she heard, immediately offered to check in on the boatyard, and on Marlowe both, no hesitation, no questions asked beyond the ones that mattered. And Marlowe, later that night, sat on the porch with her cello and practiced the adagio one more time, the notes rising into the dark, like something between a prayer and a promise. Before bed, Bree taught her a breathing technique, something she'd learned a long time ago, in a place and a life she rarely spoke about directly. 4 counts in, she said. Hold for 4. 4 counts out. Hold for 4. What's it for? For when your heart's racing and you need to slow everything down, a pause. Works in combat, works in concerts, works in pretty much every hard thing life throws at you. Marlowe tried it, her breath evening out slowly, her shoulders dropping from around her ears for the first time all evening. "Does it work for scary conversations in Washington?" she asked, a small, tired smile tugging at her mouth. Bree almost smiled back. "Almost, we're about to find out." That night, after the house had gone quiet, and Marlowe's light had finally gone dark down the hall. Bree sat alone in the kitchen, with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, and a notepad she hadn't meant to fill covered in shorthand and diagrams that made sense to no one but her, because something in her, some old and careful part of her mind, had already started running threat assessments without being asked to. Response protocols. Contingencies. The kind of thinking she'd spent 8 years trying to unlearn and apparently never had. She hated how naturally it came back. Hated it and needed it in roughly equal measure. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. Unknown number, she answered anyway. Old habits, she was learning. All came back together, whether she wanted them to or not. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical, deliberately unrecognizable. Drop it said. Walk away. You've got a kid to think about. The line went dead before she could respond. Bree sat very still in the dark kitchen. Phone still pressed to her ear, listening to nothing at all. Because whoever had made that call knew about Marlowe. Knew, specifically, precisely, that Marlowe was the one thing Bree Sutter would never risk, which meant this wasn't just Kessler anymore, scrambling alone to protect a career built on a lie. This was something bigger, something with reach, something that had already found its way, somehow, into the one part of Bree's life she'd sworn, 8 years ago, would always stay untouched. She set the phone down slowly, looked at the metal box still open on the table, the flag, the coin, the photograph with its blurred, unknowable faces, and for the first time since the hangar, since the shattering glass and the stunned silence, and the 2 words that had cracked her careful life wide open, Bree Sutter felt something colder than grief settle into her chest. Fear, not for herself, for the one person she'd built this entire quiet life to protect. Outside, the harbor kept its rhythm, indifferent, patient, the same as it always had. A bell buoy rang faintly in the dark, and somewhere out there, past the water, past the fence line, past 8 careful years of silence, something had just started moving, that Bree Sutter no longer had any way to stop. The morning after the phone call, Cedar Harbor looked exactly the same. Gray light on gray water, gulls arguing over nothing. The boatyard smelling like salt and diesel the way it always had, like nothing in the world had shifted overnight, except everything had shifted overnight. Bree stood at the kitchen window with coffee going cold in her hands, watching the harbor wake up slow and ordinary, and felt the wrongness of it like a physical thing, because the world wasn't supposed to look this calm. Not after a voice on the phone had known her sister's name without ever saying it. Not after 8 years of careful silence had cracked open in a single hangar and left her standing in the wreckage. She didn't sleep after the call, hadn't tried to. Instead, she'd sat at the table with the metal box open in front of her, running the same threat assessment over and over until the numbers stopped making sense and the sky outside went from black to gray to something almost like morning. Marlowe came downstairs at 7, cello case already slung over one shoulder, backpack over the other, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried rhythm of someone who didn't yet know her whole world had tilted sideways while she slept. "You're up early," Marlowe said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Didn't sleep. You never sleep. Slept less than usual." Marlowe paused, studied her sister's face the way she'd started doing 3 days ago. Ever since the hangar, ever since the metal box, ever since 8 years of careful lies had started coming apart at the seams, something happened. It wasn't a question. Bree had learned that about her sister a long time ago. Marlowe didn't ask when she already knew the answer. She just waited for the truth to catch up. "Phone call," Bree said. "Middle of the night. From who? Don't know." Number was blocked. Voice was distorted. Marlowe set down her mug slowly. "What did they say?" Bree hesitated, because there were 2 versions of this conversation. One where she protected her sister the way she'd protected her for 8 years, softened the edges, kept the worst of it locked in the metal box where it belonged. And one where she told the truth, the whole truth, the way she'd promised herself 3 nights ago she was done avoiding. She chose the truth. It cost her something to do it. "They told me to drop it," Bree said. Said I had a kid to think about. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, a gull screamed at nothing. Marlowe's face didn't crumble the way Bree expected. It hardened instead, jaw setting into a line that looked, for one unsettling second, exactly like Bree's own. They know about me, Marlowe said. Yeah, that's not a threat. That's a… She stopped, started again, voice tighter. That's them telling you they can reach me. I know. So what do we do? Bree looked at her sister, 19 years old, cello case still on her shoulder, standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt too small to hold the size of what was happening, and felt something cold and clear settle into her chest. Not fear anymore. Fear had burned off sometime around 4 in the morning. What was left was something harder. We don't do anything, Bree said. I do something. You go to school, you practice. You live exactly the life you're supposed to be living. That's not fair. It's not supposed to be fair. It's supposed to be safe. Marlowe's eyes went bright and furious. The particular fury of someone who loved you too much to just let you carry something alone. You don't get to protect me by disappearing into whatever this is by yourself. Not again. Not after the hangar. Not after the box. Bree didn't have an answer for that, because her sister was right, and being right didn't make it any easier to hear. She called Alvarez instead of answering, because that felt safer than continuing a conversation she didn't know how to finish. Commander Alvarez arrived within the hour, out of uniform this time, driving an unmarked sedan that pulled into the boatyard like it belonged there. She listened to the story of the phone call without interrupting, her expression flattening into something professional and careful, the look of someone recalculating risk in real time. They're not guessing, Alvarez said finally. Somebody with actual access made that call, which means this isn't just Kessler scrambling to protect her own record anymore. Meaning what? Bree said. Meaning somebody else has skin in this game. Somebody with reach into information that shouldn't have left a secure channel. Alvarez's jaw tightened, which changes the shape of what we're dealing with. Bree felt the floor shift slightly under that sentence, because for 3 days she'd been telling herself this was contained. One woman, one lie, one career built on the graves of 3 men who deserved better. Except contained things didn't call your house at 2 in the morning and threaten your sister by implication, which meant nothing about this was contained anymore. So what happens now? Bree asked. Now the investigative division formally opens the file. Alvarez met her eyes, steady. Naval Special Investigations. They'll want your full statement, detailed. Every piece of Operation Coldwater you can give them, cross-referenced against whatever records survived. And Kessler, placed under internal review as of this morning, quietly. No press yet. A pause. That won't last. Bree looked out at the harbor, at the boats bobbing gentle and unaware in the morning light, and thought about how strange it was that a life could hold 2 entirely different realities at once. The ordinary one, where boats needed fixing and Marlowe needed breakfast, and the other one, the one hiding underneath it, where a phone call in the dark could unravel 8 years of careful peace in under 30 seconds. I'll give the statement, Bree said. Whatever they need, they'll want it soon. Today, if you can manage it. I can manage it. Marlowe, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, spoke up before Alvarez could continue. I want to be there. No, Bree said. Yes, Marlowe, I'm 19. I'm not a kid you need to shield from paperwork. Her voice cracked slightly, then steadied. I've been shielded from enough. I want to understand what's actually happening. All of it. Bree looked at Alvarez, silently asking for backup she didn't get. Alvarez just shrugged, the small, careful shrug of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to get between siblings. She can wait in the outer office, Alvarez offered. Won't be in the room, but she'll be close. Marlowe accepted that with a short, sharp nod, the kind of compromise that wasn't really a compromise at all, just a temporary truce. The interview took place that afternoon in a borrowed conference room at the base gray walls. A long table, a recorder placed carefully in the center, like something that might bite. Bree sat across from 2 investigators she'd never met. Alvarez seated slightly to the side, and walked through Operation Coldwater in the same clinical, stripped-down voice she'd used with Marlowe 3 nights before. except this time there were follow-up questions. Precise ones. Timestamps. Coordinates. The layout of a compound she hadn't spoken about in 8 years, recalled now in a language cold enough to keep her from feeling the weight of it while she said it out loud. Walk us through the extraction timeline, one investigator said. A woman with sharp eyes and a notepad she barely glanced at, like she already knew most of the answers and was just checking Bree's account against them, specifically the 40 minutes before contact with hostiles. Bree closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. The abort order came in at 23:18. We didn't encounter the hostages until 23:41. 23 minutes. Yes, that's a long gap for a compound that was supposed to have light security and no reported occupants beyond the target. Yes, the investigator made a note. Didn't explain what it meant. Didn't have to. Bree already understood the shape of what she was hearing, that the timeline itself didn't add up, unless somebody higher up the chain had known about those hostages long before Bree's team ever found them in that basement room, which meant the mistake that night hadn't been an accident of bad intelligence. It had been a choice, made by someone, and covered up afterward by someone else, or maybe the same someone, wearing a different uniform now. The interview ran nearly 3 hours. By the end, Bree's voice had gone hoarse and her hands, resting flat on the table the entire time, had gone stiff from staying so deliberately still. When she finally stepped out into the hallway, Marlo was waiting exactly where she'd promised, perched on a hard plastic chair, cello case at her feet, phone forgotten in her lap. She stood the second she saw her sister's face. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. Bree, I'm okay." A pause. "I'm not okay, but I'm upright, and that's something." Marlo didn't press further, just fell into step beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed the whole walk to the parking lot, the kind of silent solidarity that didn't need words to mean something. They drove home as the sky went orange, then purple, then dark, the radio playing low and unimportant in the background. Bree kept glancing at the rearview mirror without meaning to. Old habits. Or maybe not so old, given how quickly they'd resurfaced, because somewhere out there, a phone had rung at 2 in the morning, with her sister's safety wrapped up inside the threat, and no amount of clinical, hoarse-voiced testimony was going to undo the fact that somebody, somewhere, had already found the one door in her life she thought she'd sealed shut for good. That night, after Marlo had gone to bed reluctantly, only after Bree promised to check every lock twice. Bree sat alone in the boatyard office with the lights off, watching the dark water through the window. Her phone buzzed. Not a call this time. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words, no punctuation. "Last warning, Wraith." She stared at the screen until the words blurred, then sharpened again, then blurred once more, because whoever was sending these knew her call sign. Knew it the way only someone connected to Coldwater could know it. Which meant this wasn't random intimidation from some outside threat with a grudge against the investigation in general. This was someone who'd been there, or someone close enough to the people who had been there, to know things that had stayed buried for 8 years. She didn't sleep that night either. The days that followed moved in a strange, disjointed rhythm, ordinary mornings, bleeding into extraordinary afternoons, the boatyard humming along with its usual quiet chaos while, underneath it, an investigation gathered speed, like something rolling downhill, faster than anyone could fully control. Alvarez called with updates every few days, her voice careful and measured, even when the news underneath it wasn't. Satellite records had been pulled. Communication logs cross-referenced. A picture was forming, slow and damning, of a night 8 years ago that had gone wrong in ways far more deliberate than anyone had first assumed. "There's a gap in the comm logs," Alvarez told her, 4 days after the interview, her voice tight over the phone. "Right before the ambush. 11 minutes of silence where there should have been continuous chatter. 11 minutes. Long enough for someone to relay your position to a party that shouldn't have had it." Bree sat with that for a long moment, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the wall of her small office, like it might offer an answer neither of them had yet. "Kessler," she said finally. We don't have direct proof yet, just the gap, and the fact that she was the only person with both the access and the motive to create it. A pause. We're working on the rest. Vote. Work faster. We're moving as fast as the process allows. That's not fast enough for somebody who's already threatened my sister. Alvarez didn't have a good answer for that. Bree hadn't really expected one. It was Naomi who found the next piece, though not the way anyone expected. She showed up at the boatyard on a Thursday evening, unannounced, her usual calm librarian's composure cracked open by something that looked on her almost like disbelief. She found Bree elbow-deep in an engine, grease to her wrists, and didn't wait for an invitation before speaking. "I need to tell you something," Naomi said, "and I need you to not be angry that I didn't tell you sooner." Bree straightened slowly, wiping her hands. "That's not a great opener." "No, it's not." Naomi took a breath. "My brother was one of the hostages." The wrench slipped out of Bree's hand and clattered against the concrete floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. "What?" Bree said. 8 years ago. A compound. 3 children taken from a basement room." Naomi's voice trembled, just slightly, the composure she'd worn like armor for weeks finally showing a crack. "He was 9. He still talks about the." She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "He calls you the ghost who carried him. Says he barely saw your face. Never forgot your voice." Bree stood very still. Somewhere behind her ribs, something that had been braced and locked for 8 years came loose all at once, too fast to control. "I didn't know," Bree said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "I never knew what happened to them after. Whether they made it. Whether he made it." Naomi's eyes were wet now, unguarded in a way Bree had never seen from her. "He made it because of you. And I've known who you were since that first day on the bus, when you scanned that gate like you'd done it 1,000 times before. I didn't say anything, because I didn't know if it was safe to, for either of us. And now I think silence has done enough damage for one lifetime." Naomi wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, steadying herself. "He wants to meet you, properly, when you're ready." Bree looked down at the wrench, lying forgotten on the concrete, and then up at Naomi, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear or threats or phone calls in the dark. Something closer to purpose. Closer to the reason she'd made the call she made that night 8 years ago, before any of the rest of it went wrong. "Tell him I'm ready," she said. "Whenever he is." Naomi nodded, throat working, and reached out to grip Bree's hand once, briefly, before turning to leave. At the gate, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think this is over just because it's hard. I think it's over when the truth finally catches up to the people who buried it." She left before Bree could answer, which was probably for the best, because Bree didn't have an answer yet, only the beginning of one. The break-in happened 2 nights later. Bree woke to a sound that didn't belong, a soft scrape of metal against metal, coming from the direction of the shed, faint enough that most people would have slept right through it. She wasn't most people. 8 years of trying to forget her training hadn't erased the part of her brain that startled awake at wrongness. Fully alert, before her eyes had even opened, she was out of bed, and moving before she'd consciously decided to move. Bare feet silent on the hallway floor. Past Marlowe's closed door, she checked. Just a glance, just to confirm the door was still shut, still safe, and down the stairs into the dark kitchen. Through the window she saw it. A shape near the shed. Deliberate. Careful. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to look. Her hand found her phone, texted Decker with 3 words, thumb moving on pure muscle memory. Someone's here now. Then she moved. She didn't have a weapon in the house, hadn't kept one. Not since she'd built this life specifically to be free of that kind of necessity. But she had a flashlight heavy enough to matter, and 8 years of training that didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. She slipped out the back door, keeping low, keeping to the shadows along the fence line, the way she'd been taught a long time ago in a life she'd tried very hard to leave behind. The shape at the shed froze the second the door hinge groaned. Bree caught a glimpse, dark clothing, gloved hands, a bag already half full of something pulled from the shelf where the metal box used to sit before she'd moved it 3 nights ago. into the house, into a locked drawer, on instinct she hadn't fully understood at the time. Good instinct, it turned out. "Hold it," Bree called out, voice low and level. The figure didn't hold it. They ran instead, vaulting the low fence at the back of the property with the kind of speed that spoke of training, not panic. Bree gave chase for exactly 4 strides, before headlights swept across the yard, a truck, engine roaring, pulling out onto the access road too fast to trace, taillights vanishing into the dark before she'd even reached the fence line. She stood there, breathing hard, adrenaline burning through her veins like something alive. Because the box wasn't in the shed. Because she'd moved it. Because some old, careful instinct had told her 3 nights ago not to leave it where it had always been. Whoever had just run from her yard had come looking for evidence, and they'd left empty-handed. That didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel hunted. Decker and Malone arrived within the hour, having apparently broken every speed limit between their motel and the boatyard. They found Bree sitting on the back porch steps, still in the clothes she'd slept in, staring at the dark shed, like it might explain itself if she looked hard enough. "You okay?" Decker asked, dropping down beside her. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're doing the thing where you say fine and mean the opposite. Old habit, bad one." Malone crouched in front of her, checking her over with the practiced clinical concern of someone who'd once been trained in triage and never quite lost the reflex. "Anything hurt?" "No. They ran before I got close." Bree finally looked up, meeting their eyes in the dark. They knew exactly where to look, went straight for the shed shelf. "Which means they knew about the box," Decker said grimly. "Which means somebody's been watching this place." Bree's jaw tightened, long enough to know its layout, long enough to know where I kept it. The 3 of them sat with that for a long, heavy moment, the harbor making its small, indifferent sounds in the distance, oblivious to everything unfolding on its edge. "We're not leaving," Malone said finally. "Not a question, a decision already made. Not until this is settled. You've got your own lives." "We've got a debt," Decker said, voice rough. "You carried 2 kids 11 miles through hostile ground with nothing but a sidearm, and you've spent 8 years alone carrying the weight of what it cost. We're not going anywhere until we know you and that kid inside are safe." Bree didn't argue. Some part of her, worn thin from 3 sleepless weeks and a threat that had just physically walked onto her property, was grateful enough not to. Marlo appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, having woken to the commotion, wrapped in a blanket with her hair a mess, and her eyes wide and scared, in a way that made Bree's chest ache. "What happened?" Marlo asked, voice small. Bree crossed to her, pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than either of them probably intended, and felt her sister's heartbeat racing against her own. "Somebody was in the yard," Bree said quietly. "They're gone now. Are we safe?" Bree didn't answer right away, because she wanted to say yes, wanted to hand her sister the easy comfort of certainty, the way she'd handed her easy comforts for 8 years to keep the world simple and manageable. But she'd promised herself, 3 nights ago, in front of an open metal box, that she was done lying to protect her sister from truths that mattered. "We're safer than we were an hour ago," Bree said instead. "Decker and Malone are staying close. Alvarez is going to want to know about this immediately, and whoever came looking tonight left with nothing." She pulled back slightly, held Marlo's face in both hands. "I promise you, I am not letting anything happen to you. Not while I'm still breathing." Marlo's eyes filled, but she nodded, steadying herself the way she'd learned to over the past weeks, faster than any 19-year-old should have had to learn. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They didn't sleep the rest of that night. Instead, the 4 of them sat in the kitchen, Bree, Marlo, Decker, Malone, drinking bad coffee and watching the sky slowly lighten outside the window until the harbor turned from black to gray, to something almost like morning again. Alvarez arrived at 7, grim-faced, and spent an hour photographing the shed, the fence line, the tire tracks left in the soft dirt of the access road. When she finally sat down across from Bree at the kitchen table, her expression had hardened into something Bree hadn't seen from her before. "This changes things," Alvarez said. A phone threat is one thing. Attempted theft of physical evidence is another. This is no longer a quiet internal review. What does that mean? Bree asked. It means the review board is going to move faster than they wanted to. It means Kessler's window to control the outcome is closing. Alvarez's jaw tightened. And it means whoever's protecting her is getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, or desperate people escalate. Alvarez didn't argue with that. Couldn't, really. They both knew it was just as likely to be true. Over the following days, Cedar Harbor settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. Decker and Malone, taking rotating shifts near the boatyard gate, Alvarez checking in twice daily, Marlowe practicing her cello with the kind of fierce, deliberate focus of someone using music to hold herself together. Bree caught her one evening on the back porch, mid-practice, working through the adagio's hardest passage, over and over, her bow arm tightening with each pass instead of loosening. "You're thinking too much again," Bree said, settling onto the step beside her. Marlowe lowered the bow, breathing hard, frustration written plain across her face. "I keep losing the thread, right at the climax, because you're trying to control it instead of trusting it. Easy for you to say." Bree almost smiled. Almost. Nothing about any of this has been easy. Marlowe set the cello aside, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of one hand. "Are you scared?" she asked, voice quieter now. "About all of it, Washington. The hearing. What happens if she gets away with it?" Bree considered the question carefully, the way she'd learned to consider hard questions a long time ago, weighing the truth against what her sister could carry. "I'm scared of making the wrong call," she said finally, "of other people paying for it. That's the part that's always been hard, not the danger, the weight of the decision. But you made the right call. 8 years ago, you saved those kids." "I did." Bree's voice roughened. "I also lost 3 men doing it, and no matter how right the decision was, I still carry them, every single day." Marlowe was quiet for a long moment, the harbor dark and endless behind her, the porch light casting soft shadows across her face. "I think that's what makes it the right call," she said finally. "That you still carry them." Bree turned to look at her sister, this impossibly steady 19-year-old, who somehow, again and again, knew exactly the right thing to say, and felt something in her chest ease, just slightly, just enough to breathe a little easier. "When did you get so wise?" Bree asked. "Had a pretty good teacher." Neither of them said anything else for a while. They just sat together on the porch steps, listening to the harbor, watching the dark water hold its endless, patient rhythm, while, somewhere out there in Washington, in a review board's quiet offices, in whatever shadow was still reaching for them from the edges of Cedar Harbor, the truth kept gathering speed, inevitable now, unstoppable, the way truth eventually always became once it started moving. Alvarez called 3 days later with the news that would change everything. "The board's ready," she said, voice carrying an edge of something almost like relief. "They want you in Washington by Monday, full hearing. Testimony, evidence review, the works." Bree's hand tightened around the phone. "That fast?" The break-in accelerated everything. "Combined with the calm gap and your original testimony, they've got enough to convene formally." A pause. "This is it, Bree. This is the chance to make it official, on the record, permanent." Bree looked across the kitchen at Marlowe, who'd gone very still at the sound of the word Washington, cello bow frozen mid-motion in her hand. "I'll be there," Bree said. That night, packing a small bag in the quiet of her bedroom, a clean shirt, dress slacks she hadn't worn in years, the folded flag wrapped carefully in cloth, Bree felt the weight of the decision settle fully onto her shoulders. For the first time, not the abstract weight of 8 years of silence, the immediate, physical weight of walking into a room and saying, out loud, in front of people with the power to write it into permanent record, exactly what had happened that night, and exactly who was responsible. Marlowe appeared in the doorway, watching her pack. "Come back," Marlowe said quietly. Bree looked up. "I always do. This time feels different. This time is different." Bree crossed the room, pulled her sister into a hug, held on a little longer than usual. "But I'm still coming back. That part doesn't change. Not for anything." Marlowe nodded against her shoulder, and for a long moment, Neither of them said anything else. The whole weight of everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks, settling quietly between them, the hangar, the shattered glass, the metal box, the phone calls in the dark, the shape running from the shed into the night, and underneath all of it, unshaken, the one thing that hadn't changed at all. 2 sisters, 1 promise, and a truth 8 years buried, finally ready to see daylight. Outside, the harbor kept its rhythm, patient and indifferent, the way it always had. A bell buoy rang faintly somewhere in the dark, and somewhere beyond it, past the water, past Cedar Harbor's quiet edges, Washington was waiting with all its weight, all its danger, and the truth Bree Sutter had spent 8 years too afraid to speak, now finally, unstoppably, on its way to being heard. The hearing room was smaller than Bree expected. Wood paneling, dark and old, a long conference table, microphones angled like waiting insects, flags standing at careful attention in the corners. The same silent ceremony she'd once mocked in her own head and now found herself walking straight into. Eyes forward, spine straight, because there was nowhere left to go but through it. She'd flown into Washington the night before. Decker and Malone on either side of her the whole flight, the 3 of them saying almost nothing, because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in a kitchen back in Cedar Harbor 3 weeks ago. Marlowe had stayed behind Naomi's insistence, Alvarez's insistence, Bree's own insistence, layered 3 deep until her sister finally, reluctantly, agreed. "I'll call you the second it's over," Bree had promised at the airport gate. "You better." Marlowe's chin had trembled, just slightly, before she caught it, and Bree, "Yeah, tell the truth, all of it. Don't soften it for anyone." Bree had looked at her sister, 19 years old, cello case slung over one shoulder like armor, eyes steady despite the tremble in her chin, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. "I won't soften anything," she'd said. "Not anymore." Now, sitting at the long table with Decker to her left and Malone beside him, Bree watched the room fill. Representatives from the Naval Special Investigations Division arranged folders with the careful precision of people who already knew what was inside them. A liaison from the Judge Advocate General's office reviewed notes without looking up. Someone from the Secretary of the Navy staff took a seat near the back, silent, watchful. Overhead lights cast everything in a flat, unforgiving white. Commander Alvarez sat near the front, close enough to catch Bree's eye and give her one small, steady nod. Not reassurance exactly, just confirmation. "You're not alone in this." The proceeding opened with the formalities. Bree had expected and still hated an oath, procedural language, the kind of ritual weight that made her skin itch with old, uncomfortable memory. Then the questions began. They walked her through Operation Coldwater from the beginning. Pre-mission briefing, insertion. The moment the compound turned out to be nothing like the intelligence promised, she answered each question with the same clinical precision she'd used in the borrowed conference room 3 weeks earlier, emotion stripped down to bare fact, because that was the only way she knew how to survive saying it out loud in a room full of strangers, with the power to decide what happened next. "Describe the moment you discovered the hostages," one investigator said. A man with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose, his voice neither warm nor cold, just precise. "Basement room," Bree said, "bound. 3 of them. The youngest was maybe 9. And your orders at that point? Abort. Extract. Let command reassess." "You didn't follow those orders." "No, why not?" Bree held the man's eyes, felt Decker go very still beside her, felt Malone's breathing change. Both of them braced for whatever came next the way soldiers braced for incoming fire. "Because command wasn't in that basement," Bree said. "I was. And nobody who wasn't standing in that room gets to tell me what the right call was." Silence settled over the table. The investigator made a note, didn't argue. They spent the next hour on the ambush itself, the compound layout, the movement patterns of the enemy fighters, the precision of the kill zone that had been waiting for them at the extraction point. Bree walked them through it step by step, her voice steady even when her hands, resting flat on the table, had gone white-knuckled with the effort of staying still. Then they brought out the evidence. A screen at the front of the room, lit up with a timeline communication logs, satellite imagery, timestamps lined up in careful, damning sequence. The investigator, with the silver hair, gestured toward the 11-minute gap in radio traffic, the same gap Alvarez had told Bree about weeks ago, now displayed in stark, undeniable clarity for the entire room to see. During this window, the investigator said, Operational Command had already received updated surveillance, confirming heavier enemy presence than the initial brief indicated. That information was not relayed to the team on the ground. Who had access to that surveillance feed? Someone else asked. The answer, when it came, arrived with a name Bree had been waiting weeks to hear said out loud in a room where it would matter. Then Commander Vivian Kessler, mission coordinator of record. Bree felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly. Something colder and steadier than relief. Vindication, maybe, though even that word felt too small for 8 years of carrying a lie that had never been hers to carry. They called a recess after 3 hours. Bree stepped into the hallway, legs unsteady, in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue, and found Alvarez waiting with a bottle of water, and an expression that had finally, cautiously, allowed itself something close to hope. It's going well, Alvarez said, quietly. The evidence is solid. Between the comm gap and your testimony, they're going to recommend full exoneration for the team. Formal review of Kessler's conduct, Bree nodded. Throat too tight to speak right away. She took the water, drank, let the cool of it settle something in her chest that had been burning hot for 8 years. There's something else, Alvarez added, voice dropping lower. Bree looked up. What? They pulled financial records as part of the broader investigation, found a pattern of payments to a private contracting firm, untraceable at first glance. A pause. Except the firm's registered owner turned out to be Kessler's brother. Bree's stomach went cold. What kind of payments? The kind that suggests information was being sold. Not just buried. Sold. Alvarez's jaw tightened. We think he's the one who leaked your position that night. Compromised the extraction route in exchange for compensation from parties with an interest in seeing that mission fail. And Kessler covered for him. For 8 years. Protecting her career and protecting him, tangled together into one lie she couldn't unwind without exposing both. Alvarez shook her head slowly. The break-in at your place, the threats. We believe that was him too. Trying to keep the evidence buried before it reached this room, Bree stood very still, processing the shape of it, not just ambition, not just one woman's cold calculation to save her own career, but something messier and more human underneath it. A sister protecting a brother. Choosing silence not purely out of vanity, but out of some twisted, misguided loyalty that had cost 3 men their lives and 8 years of Bree's own peace. It didn't make it forgivable. It made it, somehow, worse. When they reconvened, the room had changed in some subtle, electric way. Word had clearly spread in the recess. Hushed conversations cut short the moment Bree walked back in, eyes following her with a weight that hadn't been there before. The Secretary of the Navy's representative rose to make a statement. He acknowledged, in careful, formal language, the failures that had allowed good men to die and their reputations to be tarnished in the process. He announced that the official record would be corrected, that Briggs, Doyle, and Marsh would be posthumously awarded the Defense Valor Cross, the highest fictional honor the Navy in this story could offer, for actions consistent with courage under fire, that Decker and Malone would have every blemish removed from their service records, restored fully and permanently, and that Bree Sutter, callsign Steel Wraith, would be formally recognized for actions that had saved 3 children's lives at extraordinary personal cost. Actions the official record had spent 8 years erasing. Bree sat through the statement, with her jaw locked tight, eyes burning, refusing to let herself cry in a room full of strangers, even as every word landed like something physical against her chest. The families were there. Briggs's mother, gray-haired, weeping quietly into a handkerchief she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly this moment. Doyle's brother, holding his young nephew's hand, the boy too small to understand what was happening but old enough to know it mattered. Marcia's widow, her face a landscape of 8 years of grief finally meeting relief in the same breath. They received the folded flags, the medals, the apologies that could never fully cover what had been taken from them, offered anyway, because offering them was the only thing left to do. Bree watched Marcia's widow accept the flag with hands that shook, and felt something break loose inside her chest that she'd been holding rigid for 8 years. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Nobody had announced it. Nobody had expected it. But there, standing in the doorway with a cello case in her arms and an expression of fierce, terrified determination, stood Marlowe. Bree's breath caught. What? Alvarez, seated nearby, offered the smallest of explanations under her breath. She called me last night, asked permission. I couldn't say no. Marlowe crossed the room slowly, the weight of every eye following her, and set her cello down in the open space near the front. She didn't look at the cameras, didn't look at the officials, didn't look at anyone except her sister, sitting frozen at the long table with tears finally, openly, running down her face. She sat, adjusted the cello between her knees, lifted her bow and began to play. The adagio filled the room, the way it had filled a small living room in Cedar Harbor weeks ago, aching and clean, carrying grief and honor and love all tangled together into something too large for words to hold. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The secretary's representative stood frozen mid-gesture, forgotten paperwork still in hand. Briggs's mother pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. Marcia's widow closed her eyes. Bree sat perfectly still, watching her sister's hands move with a confidence 8 years of grief and 3 weeks of terror hadn't managed to strip away, and felt the last of the walls she'd built collapse quietly, to keep completely, in front of everyone who mattered. When the final note faded, there was no applause, just silence. The kind that holds everything a room has no other way to express. Bree stood, walked to the small microphone at the front of the table, and found her voice steadier than she expected. Honor belongs to the ones who didn't come home, she said. They made the right call. They paid the price. We're here to make sure people remember that. 4 sentences. That was all she had. It was enough. Afterward, the room dissolved into a slow, careful current of handshakes and quiet words, the kind of gestures that tried, imperfectly, to bridge something unbridgeable. Bree found herself pulled into an embrace by Briggs's mother, the older woman's shoulders shaking against her own, as she whispered, "Thank you," over and over, like the words themselves might finally settle something that had stayed unsettled for 8 long years. She held Doyle's brother's hand, met the young nephew's curious, solemn eyes, and thought about a 9-year-old boy in a basement half a world away, who'd grown into a man who still remembered a ghost carrying him through the dark. She stood with Marcia's widow, looked at the medal finally resting in her hands after 8 years of waiting, and didn't try to say anything at all. Some things didn't need words. Decker clapped her on the back, hard, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Malone squeezed her shoulder and said nothing, which somehow said everything, and Marlowe stood off to the side, cello resting against her hip, watching her sister become whole in a way she was only now beginning to understand had ever been broken. The break-in at Kessler's brother's storage facility came 3 days later, the news arriving through Alvarez in a phone call that carried an edge of grim satisfaction Bree hadn't heard from her before. They found records, Alvarez said, financial transfers, correspondence, enough to place him directly at the center of the leak that compromised your extraction route. A pause. He's cooperating now, trying to reduce his own exposure, which means he's talking about his sister, about Kessler, about everything. Alvarez's voice hardened slightly. Turns out the payments started small, escalated over years. He needed money, she had access, and somewhere along the way protecting him from consequences became the same thing as protecting herself from exposure. 2 lies, tangled into one. Bree sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the harbor from the boatyard office window. The water calm and indifferent in the afternoon light. Does it change anything? She asked finally, knowing why she did it. Alvarez considered the question carefully before answering. It doesn't change what happened. Doesn't bring Briggs or Doyle or Marsh home. But it means the review board isn't dealing with one bad actor anymore. It's dealing with a network. Which means this doesn't stop with Kessler's career. It goes further than that. Good, Bree said, and meant it. The formal disciplinary hearing for Vivian Kessler took place 2 weeks later, closed to the public, closed even to Bree, though Alvarez relayed the outcome the same evening it concluded. Immediate suspension from active duty, pending a full court-martial review. Her brother facing federal charges separate and more severe, the narrative she'd spent 8 years protecting. Finally, to keep completely, unraveled not by ambition alone, but by the same desperate loyalty that had made the original cover-up possible in the first place. Bree didn't feel triumphant hearing it. She felt tired, mostly, the particular exhaustion of finally setting down something she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without the weight of it. She saw Kessler one more time, on her last day in Washington, in a hallway just outside the room where the hearing had concluded. Kessler stood near a side corridor, flanked by 2 Navy attorneys, momentarily alone in the space between them, her posture still rigid, still composed, though something in her face had gone hollow. In a way Bree recognized, the look of someone who'd finally run out of room to maneuver. Their eyes met across the hallway. Neither of them moved for a long moment, then Bree did something that surprised even herself. She came to attention, rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't forgiveness either. It was something harder to name an acknowledgement that, despite everything, despite 8 years of lies and cover-ups and a brother's greed dressed up as loyalty, the uniform still meant something. The chain of command still carried weight, even when the people inside it failed it completely. Kessler's face flickered with something unreadable. Then, almost against her own will, her hand rose and returned the salute. Stiff, reluctant. But there, when she lowered her hand, Bree spoke, voice carrying just far enough down the empty hallway to land. Sometimes courage is staying quiet, she said. But today courage was telling the truth. Kessler held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Something passed behind her eyes. Not quite regret, not quite acceptance. Something caught painfully between the two. Then she turned and walked away. Her attorneys closing ranks around her. The sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor until there was nothing left but silence. Bree stood there a moment longer, watching the empty hallway, and felt something inside her finally, fully settle. The drive back to Cedar Harbor took most of the day. Decker and Malone rode with her, the 3 of them mostly quiet, the radio playing low and unimportant in the background, the landscape shifting slowly from federal buildings to suburbs to the long, open stretches of highway that eventually led home. Marlo was waiting on the porch when they pulled in, cello case beside her, and the moment the car stopped, she was down the steps and across the driveway before Bree had even fully opened the door. The hug nearly knocked her over. "You did it," Marlo said into her shoulder, voice thick. "I heard," Alvarez called. "You actually did it," Bree corrected, pulling back to look at her sister's face. "You walked into that room and played for them. That took more courage than anything I said." Marlo wiped her eyes, laughing despite herself. "I almost threw up in the hallway first. Nobody could tell. You could tell." "I could tell," Bree admitted, smiling, actually smiling. Something that still felt unfamiliar on her face after 8 years of careful neutrality. "You were perfect anyway." Naomi appeared on the porch a moment later, waving, and behind her, Bree caught sight of a face. She didn't immediately recognize a young man in his mid-20s, tall, sun-weathered, standing a little uncertainly near the gate, like he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to be there. "That's him," Naomi said quietly, coming down the steps. "My brother. He wanted to meet you properly, if you're ready." Bree looked at the young man, the same boy, grown now, who'd once been 9 years old in a basement half a world away, carried 11 miles through hostile ground, by a woman whose face he'd barely seen and felt her throat close up entirely. She crossed the yard slowly. He met her halfway, For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he extended his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her into an embrace that lasted long enough to say everything words couldn't reach. "I never forgot your voice," he said, voice rough. "I used to think I made you up, that you weren't real, that nobody could have actually done what you did and just disappeared afterward." "I had to disappear," Bree said quietly. "I didn't have a choice back then. You have one now." He pulled back, studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. "Thank you for all of it, for never giving up, even when it cost you everything." Bree didn't trust herself to answer that. She just nodded, throat too tight for words, and let the moment settle into something she'd carry with her for the rest of her life, the missing piece of a story that had haunted her for 8 years. Finally complete. They stayed for an hour, gathered loosely around the boatyard in the fading afternoon light. Naomi, her brother, Decker, and Malone trading old stories that made everyone laugh. Despite the weight of everything underneath them, Marlo perched on a crate with her cello, playing something lighter now, something with hope, threaded carefully through the notes. Before they left, Naomi's brother pressed something into Bree's hand, a photograph, creased and faded with age, showing 4 faces, 3 of them children, one a young woman in fatigues, whose features were barely visible in the dim light, but whose presence was unmistakable all the same. "We never forgot," he said simply. After they left, Commander Alvarez arrived, out of uniform, carrying a 6-pack and a question that hung in the evening air. "The review board wants to know if you'd consider coming back," she said. "Consulting, training the next generation. Something low profile, on your own terms." Bree looked at the offer for a long moment, really considered it, the way she hadn't let herself consider anything about her old life in 8 years, and then shook her head, smiling. "I'm good here," she said. "You do a lot of good out there. You know that. I'm doing good right here." She gestured toward the boatyard, toward Marlo tuning her cello on the porch, toward the whole quiet, hard-won life she'd built board by board, out of the wreckage of that night 8 years ago. "This is where I'm supposed to be." Alvarez nodded, unsurprised, and raised her beer in a small, quiet toast. "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, there are people who'd be glad to have you back." They drank as the sun slipped lower over the harbor, turning the water gold, then copper, then a deep, settling blue. That night, long after everyone had gone, Bree's phone buzzed once. A message, drafted and deleted a dozen times before it was finally sent, she could tell. Somehow, from the careful, cautious wording, it read only, "Thank you." Bree stared at it for a long time, thought about responding, thought about everything she could say about Briggs, about Doyle, about Marsh, about 8 years of silence that had cost so much more than either of them could ever fully repay. In the end, she set the phone down and didn't respond. Some conversations didn't need an answer. The truth had already said everything that mattered. The next morning, Bree woke before dawn, the way she had for 8 years, and walked down to the water. The first light was just beginning to break over Cedar Harbor, painting everything in soft shades of gray and gold. She stood at the edge of the dock, hands in her pockets, and let herself think, really think, without flinching away, about Briggs, about Doyle, about Marsh, about the weight of command, the cost of hard decisions, the price silence had extracted from her for 8 long years. And for the first time since that night in the compound, the weight felt lighter, not gone. It would never be fully gone, but lighter, manageable, something she could finally carry without it crushing her. Marlo appeared beside her a few minutes later, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, and passed one over without a word. They stood together, watching the boats begin their slow procession out toward open water. "You know what the best part is," Marlo said finally, breaking the silence. "What's that?" "You don't have to be a ghost anymore." Bree looked at her sister and felt a smile break across her face, real, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself wear in 8 long years. "No," she said softly, "I guess I don't." Behind them, the boatyard slowly stirred to life. Decker and Malone loaded gear into a truck, preparing for the long drive back to their own separate lives. though both had promised, more than once, more than casually, that they'd be back. Naomi arrived to open the school library for the day, waving as she passed. The town woke up around them, oblivious to the quiet, hard-won victory that had unfolded in its midst. Somewhere in the distance, a bell buoy rang softly, marking time the way it always had, patient and indifferent, the same sound that had haunted Bree's sleepless nights for 8 long years, and now, somehow, felt almost peaceful. Marlowe lifted her coffee in a small mock toast. "To Steel Wraith," she said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "May she finally get some rest." Bree clinked her mug against her sister's, throat tight with something that wasn't grief anymore. "And to the person I get to be now." They drank. The light grew stronger over the water. The gray sky slowly warmed into blue, and Bree Sutter, mechanic, sister, guardian, and once, long ago, a ghost who carried children through darkness, at the cost of everything, she had stood at the edge of Cedar Harbor and felt, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, like a woman who had finally, to keep completely, come home.